Hi, welcome to today's video. Our topic today is going back to Alteryx macros. Macros are a very powerful tool that Alteryx allows you to use in order to repeat processing as well as some other purposes, such as there are features and functionality and macros can perform that a normal workflow can't. If you're interested in macros and haven't developed your macros yet, go ahead and check out my video, Introduction to Macros. But what I want to do today is talk about some of the best practices or tips that I have used and learned in order to make my development of macros a bit less stressful. You can learn where some of the little things are hidden and some of the things that you will want to do to make it more consistent. And so I've developed some macros and workflows that will highlight these tips and get you going through it. To that point, we want to be talking about 5 different quick tips. One is to rename macro input, how to enable and disable processing, which I found by accident and is really awesome for some of your more advanced macros. We'll talk about how to get multiple files into your workflow. And we'll look at some of the output options when you're doing that within the macro. And finally, we'll talk about how can you get more information and understand what to do with all of these actions. So to get started, let's bring up our Alteryx. And you can see that we have an empty workflow. So the basic methodology for developing macros, if we talk about it in some of my other videos, is you start with a good workflow and then you turn it into a macro once you know that it works. Some people don't like to start that way. They like to actually know it's a macro. So a couple of things we talk about very basically within creating a macro is that you come in here in workflow and start it out as a macro this way. You can also turn it into a macro at any point in time by simply going into the interface and dragging any macro widget, such as the macro output. So if we come back into our configuration here, you can see that our workflow is indeed a macro. It's also very helpful because you'll be using some of the configuration that's specific to a macro. And as you notice over here on the left, I have my interface designer. And it's unpinned because I don't use it all the time. And I can always pin it when I want to use it. Again, it takes up space. And I can always unpin it. And we get that through View. We have Interface Designer. So if you haven't done this yet, I recommend that you go ahead and open up the Interface Designer view and then go ahead and unpin it so that it drags itself into the left over here. This will make your macro development a whole lot easier. One thing I've found as well that it's good to do, if you notice that all these widgets have a different icon. And if you come into macros, you can see that I have different icons for my macros as well. Ones in blue circle are the default, and I typically don't use those. They're sort of in development and I haven't gotten them clean. I have defined where my macros can be found through the options. And we have data set defaults. And here I have told it where to find my macros. I can give it multiple directories to find the macros, and that makes it so that it will go ahead and pop up, and I can add into this my macro directories going into the add remove tool. Notice I have another subdirectory inside of macros, code macros work in progress, and I have not pinned that one, so I typically don't use it. And then finally, we can talk about here in the Interface Designer Layout view, we have the configuration or properties, and this is where you can choose a custom icon and choose something that you like, see what it looks like when you actually display it, and make it your own. So go ahead and close this out, just so we don't confuse ourselves. And we'll get started with the first quick tip. So the first quick tip is to rename the input columns that come out of your macro. Part of me likes to believe that this should be the first thing that you learn to do, and I apologize if I didn't cover it completely or accurately in some of my earlier videos, and I struggled to work with my macros and not understand this quick little methodology. And when I finally did, I use it for every place that I have macro input. So I'll drag my macro in here. And this is a very simple macro. What I'll do is I will pass in a input stream that has whichever columns you want into it. But in my default configuration, I have X and Y. I have a formula that adds X and Y together to get Z. Make sure everything's afloat on the way out, and then set everything back out again. And when you run this, as we've run this as a test, you see that what you get is X, Y, and Z, with Z being the sum of X and Y. When you run this as a macro, and let me drag in my workflow that does this as well, so what I do here is I have A, B, and C, and I want to sum A and B. I make sure they're all integers. Now you can go to a lot of extreme to remember and to configure how to use the data types, but the problem is not so much reconfiguring the data types, but remembering which fields became which output fields while running your macro. So I identify that X is A and Y is B, and so if I ran this without using this tip, I would end up with X, Y, and Z as my output stream. But instead, as you can see, let's just go ahead and run this very quickly. I have A, B, and C still coming out, and the sum of A, B. So how did I do that? Well, the sum of A, B is because I renamed it here, but the A and B did not get changed at all. What you can do is to put an action between your input stream, because the only columns that will be affected, or only fields that will be affected, are those that are identified as part of this processing, so that for this processing to work, I must have the fields X and Y. And so Alteryx will rename the two fields, in this case A and B, to fields X and Y and do the work. But Alteryx keeps some really good metadata working on your processing, so it knows the name of the column that went into the macro. And so therefore you can do this action, which is in the drop-down list of update select with reverse field map. That's a very, very tough way of saying is put the field names back to what they were when they started. So what this will do is turn fields X and Y back into A and B because that's what I passed in. And if we look at the metadata associated with these fields, you can see that these are text input, but here is the formula X plus Y. So Alteryx is keeping some information about the source, where it's coming, and what its name changes are, so that you can go ahead and utilize this very simple action of connecting your input stream to a select right before your output, and simply update select with reverse field map, which puts the names back the way they were. So this way you don't have to try to remember what the new names became when you're working with a macro that's doing some kind of calculation in the middle of your workflow. Moving onwards, let's look at enable and disable processing, something that I've used to start out with in workflows, and then I actually added them to some interactive applications before I added them into macros themselves. So that allows for a non-human intervention in order for a process to run. So it helps us go ahead and pull up my Alteryx. I have some already built workflows, and then we will build it with the tips when we go through it. So if you haven't used the tool container, in order to primarily, if it exists inside of the documentation set of widgets, I like it so much that it is on my favorites. There's a great documentation points, but you also may notice that there's a little slide bar up here, and that slide bar enables and disables it. So if we run this quick little workflow, we come in with a set of data, just 3 records, and we're going to append this is blue, this is green, and this is other onto the records. We run this, we union the results together because we've actually split that workflow into 3 pieces. And you see that what we end up with is the 3 records 3 times, one with each of the color descriptions. What that means is that if today I want to analyze the data according to the blue algorithm, I can disable these 2, run this, and then all we get out of it is this is blue. And you can do this in any set of combinations. Off, off, and other. So what we want to do is, this is great, but what happens if your calculation is dependent upon a piece of data, and you're going to analyze that piece of data and come up with a decision as to which calculation to do, and you want to just simply run one of those calculations through a macro as a standard calculation, or even within a normal workflow, because you cannot turn on and off dynamically in a workflow. You notice I did this manually. So we want to turn this into a macro and allow a parameter to come into our data flow so that we can determine which of the 3 calculations, in this case just tagging it with the color of choice, we want to do. So what we do is we start out with that little piece of workflow, which is blue, green, and other. I collapse those down. If you haven't collapsed these down before, it's this button right here. Saves you space. I left them expanded just so you could see them, but here we've collapsed them down, so you have to believe me when I say that what's in here is each of those little processes. Here's the other, just so you can see. So what I'm doing is I'm bringing in my work data flow, and as we talked about in the previous quick tip, we went ahead and did a reverse field map so that what we come out at the other end is the same fields, and then we'll simply tag it with one or the other. And we'll leave this test color as a parameter coming in so we can see how we build this. Again, you can make this runnable. This runs with a simple set of data, and what you see in going out of it is that this is other. So now we want to go ahead and we can test how this works very quickly by coming in and creating a workflow to where we have the data set coming in. I just wanted to show you we'll be using a formula that is actually a Boolean test, and you can do that within your individual workflow, which is simply saying that if a equals 1, we want to return the Boolean true. Otherwise, we just want to return the Boolean, which will be true. If it equals to 1, if it's not equals 1, the return will be false. So you understand how you can use in a formula a conditional statement and return a true or false Boolean, because we're going to want to use that when we get to our macro. So that was here as part of my testing to go on, which I guess is an aside. Quick tip is don't be afraid to do some testing just to see how things work. In this case, we're going to pass in either a blue, green, or yellow parameter into our macro. So let's go ahead and save this macro. I've already saved this, but I wanted to show you how to build it. So into a file, save as, browse, macros. This is tips. This is our conditional processing. Yes, we want to replace it. Come into our workflow. It will notice that it's been replaced. We can say yes. Oh, we forgot to do one very important thing. So let's put something pretty on the top of this. Go into our interface designer. Go into configuration, custom icon. Click on macros. That's where my icons are. We were using Toad Wizard if I'm not mistaken. Open that. Save it. You see over here the macro tips that are there. So they are what we wanted it to be, which is the Toad Wizard. Long story behind that. Drop me a comment if you want to know the whole story. Otherwise, we'll just let it go as the Toad Wizard. Click OK. We need to map into it, going into it as well. All these little things to do. There it is, tested. A is my data stream. We run this, and what we get out of it is this is other, because that was a default condition, because we didn't actually do anything with this workflow as far as testing this color. So what we want to do is to create an action. And actually we'll create 3 actions, one to determine whether or not to turn on or off blue, turn on or off green, and turn on or off other. So we do that by very quickly going into our interface, and I'm actually showing you as a quick tip how I build this, just make sure it works. We grab action here, connect it up there. Let's go ahead and test to see if it's blue, which is our first choice. This action has not been configured, so what we want to do is not update the value, but update value with formula. We want to update the disabled. You notice it's not an enabled option. What we have is a value for disabled. So disabled is currently true. So we'll want to set that to the value of false when it is blue and true when it's not blue. That determines how we want to create the formula down here. And so that I don't have to type this in and get it wrong. And also so that you can see it, we'll drag over the 3 different formulas that we'll be using. So if it is not equal to blue, disabling becomes true. So reverse logic there. So, and I also put a lowercase in here because I really don't want to worry about the case that's coming in. So we will copy that out of here. And we'll basically say that if our parameter is not equal to blue, it will be true, and true will allow us to set this to disabled. Click on that, it's configured. We can run this. Well, first we want to save it. So we come into our test. Test gets updated. We run this through. You notice we only took one step, which is the fact that blue was coming in. So therefore we turned on blue. We undisabled it, so to speak. And the other was left the way it was. Let's finish this out by going with the other 2, and then we can do our testing. But when I did this in real life the first time, I did it one step at a time rather than do it all as a big bang. Let's go back to our interface, drag another action here. Oh, another quick tip. Let's go here, and so we don't confuse ourselves in the future. Let's come into there and do our annotation and simply say blue test. And before we get carried too far away, let's make this the green test. And again, what we want to configure is to say we want to update. Oh, sorry, let's go ahead and connect it all in so we get the right questions to have to be answered. Connect you in, connect you out to the green because it's the green test. But you notice there's a lot of extra noise here. I'm not sure why all of these options come up because they're pretty much all the same. We want to update the value with a formula. We'll choose the first one in disabled, which is the true here. And we will copy in our green test, which is the same, which is the lowercase if not equal to green. Again, quick flash, it's one at the top. Lowercase is not equal to green. makes it true, which means it's disabled. We save that. Come back to our workflow. So while this should be the same, let's go ahead and disconnect blue and connect green. So now it should say green and other. We haven't worked on the other one yet. We click there, we say green and other. So now the blue is turned off still. So we know we're making progress. And then our final change is going to be to drag one more of our actions into here. Let's go into our annotation, or comment as it's known. Other test. So you want to always forget to do this along the process. I get ahead of myself all the time. Let's connect it up so we get the right choices up here. There we go. You notice this one's a whole lot cleaner. Not exactly sure why this always goes quite so strange, but again, it's why we do these quick tips so you don't get scared away when you do it on your own. Update value with the formula. Replace a specific string. Don't you replace a specific string down here? There we go. Update value with formula. There we go. We didn't need a string. We're going to choose the disabled value of false. So now again, if you go into look at one of my earlier videos, we talked about some of the unique conditions you can use in your tests. And that is the in comparative. So if this lowercase is in blue and green, we want to turn off or disable the other. So if this is true, we disable the other, which is exactly what we want to do, so we can copy out this test. If it's not in blue or green, then it would be false, and we would not disable it, and we would run through. Let's copy that. Paste it in down here in our formula. Save it out. Come back to our test. It's been updated. So now if we run green through here, we should, cross our fingers, only get green, which we do. So that is awesome. We know blue is turned off for green and other is turned off for green. Let's go ahead and do our yellow test. Run our yellow test. And we can see that it is the other calculation for those three records. So that's a way that you can do conditional processing using tool containers, enabling and disable them depending upon a condition. Hopefully that'll help you. I've had a few questions asked by other people of how to do some conditional processing, and this is the way I recommend that you go. So let's talk about inputting multiple files. And I always like to remind people about the requirement when you're dealing with multiple file processing that you have to have a stub that's sort of the example of what it is that you need to process. This is actually a multi-part quick tip, which sort of takes it out of the realm of quick tip. But I wanted to start with keep it simple, understand the simple solutions, and then move onward to something a bit more complex. So let's bring up our Alteryx. I have some workflows already loaded to make this go a little bit more efficiently. So people say we have to read multiple files, multiple tables. Let's look at dynamic input. And this is your dynamic input, which is found in Developer. Make it a little bit bigger. So there we go. So your dynamic input is found in Developer. I was originally worried about using some of these until I talked to the Alteryx people many years ago when I first started this journey, and they said no, development just simply means not that they're in development, but that they're things that more of a development kind of person would want to deal with, as opposed to your more entry-level business analyst that's not familiar with the programming language, etc. But that being said, they really are not that sophisticated to use. It's just the category they gave them. So in our dynamic input, what you must do is provide it with a stub. In this case, we used it as a stub XLS. This is the standard that it needs to read, and then we want to modify it from there to get it to read multiple files that are identified in the input. Now, I'll tell you right off the bat, I found this most useful if you check some of my database processing workflows, and I use these for range checking, etc. This is really designed around the SQL language, because you can see here that you can modify the SQL query, and that's only if you actually have a SQL query that you're dealing with. In this case, we don't, because we actually have a list of files, so we wanted to read a list of data sources. We happen to have 3 data sources that we're going to try to pass into this. Each of these has the exact same data into it, which makes it a little crazy to see the results, but it was easier that way. So if you have, so the question becomes, if I have 3 exact same type of data files or multiple data files that are the same type of data, why can't I just read them in with a dynamic input widget? And so what we want to do is pass the name to each of these files into this one and say, hey, read these for me, please. And when we do that, we get an error message, because dynamic input assumes or requires you to have the exact same data file type that you are reading. So if you have multiple of the same data file type, same data structure, then you can read it with the dynamic input. If you don't have that, then you need to go into something more sophisticated, and we're going to talk about 2 of those options, one of which is obviously going to be your macro to read multiple inputs. So I developed a macro, which we'll talk about, because this is basically putting all the pieces together, except for the stub part right here. 2 things we want to do is we want to be able to also identify the name of the file that we are reading, and so we're going to take this input file name and put it into a text input, and then go through and append it to the stream so we know which file it came from, because we can't get that from this workflow. So all that we do here is that we have a stub. In this case, I used a YXDB as my stub, and we're going to take an action of saying change the input data tool. This is update input data tool. It's one of the options. What that'll do is change this input from our stub YXDB file to an input for the tool type that's coming in with the file name. And what this means simply is that if the data file matches the defaults for that extension, then I'll be able to read it, provided it has the same data definitions going out. That being said, what we do is we change its name. We do something here to set all the data types. This is a sort of a trick I learned from another analyst, and that is that we want to go ahead and use the multi-field formula so that we can change the data type to v-string, so that everything that comes out of this input is a v-string. Because we want to deal with different data types, each of the different data types will be assigning, or different data file types, each of the different data file types will be assigning their own default data types to the stream, and the lowest common denominator is strings, because that's what a text file will read. So we want to go ahead and change all of the fields, no matter what they are, into a v-string, so we have a common type of format of the data going out. We'll then also have a little bit of fun here and use the auto change field type widget, one of those that's here in the preparation. Both of these are actually in preparation. And this will give it the best guess for what the data types are going out, and that's good because if you have the same type of data going in, it'll get the same type of data going out, and all this will work fine as far as a macro is concerned. So we go ahead, and what we want to do to run this macro is we've inserted the macro into our previous workflow as in the place of the dynamic input widget, and we pass those same 3 file names in. We can now run this, and you can see that it works. And it actually has my 3 sets of the same data, but it tells me which files that they came out of. And again, this works because each of these files fits the default type. What happens if we add a 4th file that is slightly different as far as the default is concerned? And what we're going to look here is I have a couple of files that we're saving by the side, and this is another example of this spreadsheet. And we're going to go ahead and insert this in. And just to let you know ahead of time, what happens is that this Excel spreadsheet has 2 tabs in it, not 1 tab or 1 worksheet. And because it has 2, it's not going to be able to process as a default because the default input processor will want to know which of those 2 tabs that you want to use. Proving that simply, we go here, we run, it says, wait a minute, no sheet is specified. You must specify a sheet name because you have more than 1. So again, once you vary off of that default methodology for that file, it cannot read multiple ones in. Now to solve this problem, we're going to take another look at this process, and that is going to make the problem simpler. Because once you get into the more sophisticated workflow, you can address and solve that very sophisticated problem using some of the tips that we had at the beginning of this process, as well as some of the other tips and other samples I've had in my video set. But to keep it for this point, we're going to go into the next step of sophistication, is that if I have Excel spreadsheets that all have the same data structure, but some of them have 1 tab, some of them have 2 tabs, 3 tabs. They have different names for the tabs. So I need to process each individual spreadsheet tab inside of that Excel file and tell the input what I want to use. Now, long story short, what we want to do here is we're going to create a little macro. And the macro is not actually going to process our data. What it's going to do is actually create the Excel file name that includes the name of the tab or sheet inside of it. And we get that through another quick tip, which is if you look at the input data for an Excel spreadsheet, one of the options you have on table query is to simply return a list of sheet names. And so what that will do is give us a list of the sheets that are in that file. We also return the full file name, so that then we can do is make a directed file name in the Alteryx standard that tells the input widget the Excel spreadsheet file name and the spreadsheet or tab or sheet that's inside of it that we need to do. To show you what this looks like, again, I use a stub. Just to show you the example, we can run this macro. And as we pass in this stub, what we get out of it is a list of the sheet names. So here's the full file name. And you notice that the full file name has on it, after the 3 pipes, a list of sheet names because that is what we executed as this input. And this is the only sheet name that's in there, otherwise there'd be multiple records. And so what we need to do is to take this sheet name and replace the list of sheet names designation here with that sheet name. We very simply do that with a formula, which is the replace. And again, we talked about this formula and this function within this formula in another one of my videos. So check out all the functions. You'll find that a lot of these are useful and will help make your life easier. What I get out of this then is, and you can see it down here if you squint, but can't make it bigger. What we have out of here is the full path of the file, 3 pipes, and then the name of the sheet. This directs Alteryx input to go right to that sheet for us. Having said and created that, what we can do now is that we can pass that information into a dynamic input that is designed around a spreadsheet. And what we want to do here is to read a list of data source names, which is the Excel full file name option from this drop-down list. So running this, and you'll see it works quite well. So what we did coming into it is we passed it these three names of the files. And what we got out of this macro is 4 records, one for each of the tabs. That is the sheet name itself as opposed to just the file name. So it's file name, 3 pipes, and the sheet names. And you can see down here each one of those 4 tabs is represented for the 3 files. We pass that into the dynamic input, and then it can read all those files and give us the 4 sets of records coming out the other end for a total of 12 records. So now we don't even have to use a macro to read the spreadsheets, but we do need a macro to make the file name for us, and then we pass that into the dynamic. So this works when we have the same format of the same data file type. Where this breaks down, which is what we'll talk about in the next tip, is that if I have one additional file, and I brought that up here to show you that while it has data and extra being the 2 tabs in it, it also has this new that has 1 additional column. So if they don't have the exact same format, the dynamic input will now error out on us. We can do that by going into this record, pasting in Excel file 4, run this, and you see down here it says it's a warning that the new tab in that spreadsheet has a different list of fields. And so therefore our output does not include that information. So the next tip we'll be looking at talks about how to deal with different output from multiple of the same file type, but not necessarily the same structure. Let's step up to that next level of complexity. Macro output options for multiple files. So we need to move a little workflow into a macro because our structure is not the same for all the files and tabs, in this case spreadsheets, that we want to read. Simply put, we need to put a macro right here rather than this dynamic input. Turns out to be a very simple macro, because this tip isn't about writing this macro, but how to use it. We have our input data, we have our stub, we tell it what sheet to read. What we want to do is we'll be passing in an Excel full file name, which includes the 3 pipes and the name of the tab or sheet. And all we want to do now is not update the input, but simply update the file value, because you notice right here, file value, it has the entire path, 3 pipes, and the name of the sheet. We're going to read that and create that with our 1 macro, and then go ahead and pass that into this macro to actually go ahead and read each of those sheets and send that output to us. Quick question you should be asking is, well, why is this any different than what we're doing with dynamic input? And the answer is, we're not doing anything different. The difference happens to be over here in our configuration. And as we pin this so you can see it a bit more easily, typically you've seen me change my icon, but down here is the output fields change based on macros configuration or data input. In other words, it is not, if you do not have the same definition of fields going into your macro output, what would you like to do? Well, by default, it says all iterations will have the same output schema, error if different, which is what would happen if we didn't change this. And instead, we want to auto configure by name, wait until all iterations are run. So it's basically hold that data and create one output coming through. This will slow down your macro execution because it will be accumulating all the data inside of the macro and only passing it back through your data flow once it has been completed, and it may take some memory to do so, but in the cases of the typical size files that you'll be dealing with as far as spreadsheets are concerned, that isn't really much of a cost. We can also alter configure by position so that each of the columns is the same in sequence as opposed to by name. And that brings up another set of questions as how you want to process it. But in our case, all we had to do is change this option. Let's unpin this because we need this room. And you can see here's my quick little workflow that I created. It looks a lot like the previous one. We have our input of our 4 files. 1 tab, 2 tabs, 3 tabs, or 2 tabs here as well. I think these are both 1 tab. This is 2 tabs. And this happens to be the 3rd tab that has a different set of columns. So we read those out, get them into our individual names of our files, pass them into our new macro, and then we will get the output coming out the other side. Clicking this to run very quickly, you can see that that is indeed what happened. Here is the name of all of the tabs that we will be using for our 4 spreadsheets. And if you look at the output, you can see that D is null, except down here at the bottom when it was processing that very last file and tab. So now we've made this a bit more complex so that we can read different data types coming out. And in the real world, if you have mixed data types, mixed data formats, you can solve that problem with macros, but it'll be a bit more sophisticated. So thanks for sticking with me. You've gotten to the final of my quick tips. And again, sorry this isn't quite as quick as I had hoped it to be, but really not looking at doing any work, just simply showing you some options and to intrigue your imagination so you can go off on your own, understanding macros and how to put things together and to how to overcome some of the issues that you might see or run into as you're doing it yourself. And so to that matter, we're coming up to the last one. Finding configuration widget actions. In other words, you need to change things. What do you change them to when you start looking at how these are? And I chose to use the output widget for databases because it's one that I use quite often, and I actually show you then how we can utilize that in not necessarily or not only in a macro, but using it in an application. So thanks for sticking this long. Please, if you've watched it this long and are ready for this final section, obviously you like what you see, so give me a thumbs up, subscribe, give me a comment if something is confusing that you want me to delve into more deeply in the coming videos, and I appreciate your viewership. Now let's jump into this last quick tip, and it is a pretty quick, and we'll show you how we're getting through it. And let's bring up Alteryx. I preloaded some of my workflows as well. So basically what you have in this workflow is that you are going to be writing into a database. In my case, it is a Amazon Web Services MySQL database. I'm going to be putting it into a database table. This is how it looks from the file and database name. The question that we want to answer and what you need to understand is if you want to alter the way this output works, and in that case we're going to look at the output options, how do you find what all these options are? Well, I'm thinking that there might be a resource somewhere on the internet. I haven't looked for it. I don't mind doing some legwork and finding out what's going on. It makes me think about it as I build my workflows. But let me show you how this looks. As you can see here, we're not actually going to run this macro, by the way. We just simply want to evaluate it. So what I'm looking at doing is to go ahead and compile that list of options. So if you come into your output widget, you see here are all the options. I went ahead and entered each of those options into this table because I want to save this information. The only reason why I created this as well. So here are the names as they appear on the drop-down list. But what value does Alteryx give to them as far as processing it through a macro if we want to alter it? So what I did to get each of these is to start at the very top at a very simple one. We want to append existing, for example. And so I come in here and I created just this stub of a macro parameter, and I want to update a value. And then what I can do is expanding out what's in here. I can see my output option is called append. So therefore I know that append existing, the value that I need to change to get this output widget to do that is append. And then what I simply did is went through each one of these. Yes, I know it's legwork, but it's not a very long list. And so here for delete data and append is just simply delete, sort of what you would think it to be. And so we continue onwards to the next one, which is overwrite table drop. Looking at the update value, you can see that it is overwrite. I should have thought that would have thought they said drop, but that isn't. It's overwrite. So again, walking through each of these, I was able to go ahead and create this list, which is nice and clean. I gave it name and value because thinking ahead, I wanted to use this in an application, and I'll show you why I did that as well. So once I created this file, I copied this input text widget. I went ahead and simply copied and pasted it into a workflow where I set the data types to be a bit more friendly, and then I saved it as a YXDB file. I did that so then I can use it in an application. So here's my application. Let's run this very quickly just so you can see what it does. Didn't get fancy, didn't change names. Basically what it looks at is it takes the name from that file. Let's cancel this. Well, we'll show you, come to that in a minute. So here are all the options that you see in the drop-down list of an output data going to a database. I want to do create new. I click in finish. It goes and shows me that the value that it will assign to that choice is the create. It took that from the value. So therefore, when I run this as an application, I want to do more things, et cetera, and then save the database file at the end. I can ask the user what their option is. They can choose it. I can then translate it to the proper word, use that in my replacement, either through my macro or some other means, and off we go. How that all works is in the drop-down, you want to do an external source. It says it must contain name and value fields. I went ahead and chose my file because again it had name and value. So it'll show the name and give it the value coming out, and then my update cell simply takes that value and updates the first column so that I know what it became and can show it to you in this application. So that quick tip is to show you how to go about finding what all those different parameters might be that you need to change or that you can change. And it's nice to look into to see what all of them might be. There are a lot of parameters associated with every widget, or some of the widgets have more than others. And it's up to you to delve into them. Through the action is the only way I know to do it. You can see that these are all the things I can change within the output data widget going to a database. And that lets me move forward. That's the end of my quick tips. I hope you enjoyed them. Again, drop a comment if you liked it. Drop a comment if you want me to delve into something more deeply to show you how to solve a problem that you might be experiencing. Otherwise, have a great day. I had fun making this. It was a bit more extensive than I had anticipated, but I am very happy that it's been finished. Take care.